Hello and welcome to the Night Sky Reader. I'm here with a story to help you relax, meditate, or gently drift to sleep. Tonight, the hours Hoarfrost takes. Settle in, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's begin. You do not go far. You remain beside one winter hedgerow and stay long enough to see whether a single twig's dark edge will turn white with hoarfrost. At first it hardly seems like enough. The twig is thin, brown-black, a little glossy on the youngest wood and duller where the bark is older. It rises from the woven side of the hedge at about eye level, then makes a small fork, one arm lifting slightly higher than the other. Just below the fork sits a dormant bud, tight and matte, no larger than a grain of rice. There is also a thorn a little farther out, clean and narrow, with the stem behind it fading into the darker tangle. Evening has already given up its last color. The cold is settled. Nothing visible happens yet. A plain winter twig in a plain hedgerow at the margin of a lane and a field. Close enough that you can make out the slight puckering where the bud joins the stem, the shallow seam running along one side, the fine roughness on the older wood. If part of you still wants a quicker sort of comfort, something soft and immediate, the hedge does not provide it. It offers bark, angles, still air, and a process so slow that you can only meet it by remaining here. The hedgerow itself is not broad in your attention. There is a suggestion of depth behind this first branchwork, crossing stems and darker pockets where the weave of growth thickens. But your eye keeps returning to the same small span of wood. A lane lies on one side, field on the other, though after dusk they are mostly felt as openness and shelter, not scenery. The exposed twigs lean toward the colder air. The inner stems hold to the hedge's small interior stillness. The difference matters, though you do not need to name it yet. The air has that dry, exact cold that sharpens outlines before it changes them. It touches the bridge of your nose, the backs of your hands, the skin just above your collar. It smells faintly of bark and winter soil, less like earth turned over than earth held fast beneath its own hardness. Somewhere far off, a sound passes and thins away. Then there is only the hedge again, close and sufficient. You stay with the anchor twig. It is almost surprising how much there is to see before any frost arrives. The bark along the lower side is slightly darker than the upper, not because it is wet, but because the open sky finds the top surface and leaves the underside in finer shadow. The fork is not symmetrical. One branch is straighter, one more hesitant. The bud sits where last season's growth paused and prepared itself, its scales fitted close, their edges so neat they seem drawn in darker brown. Beneath the bud is a tiny collar where the bark gathers in a faint ring. If you follow the twig outward toward the thorn, the surface changes. The younger wood is smoother there, almost polished by weather. It reflects very little, only enough to separate itself from the deeper mat of the interior stems. The thorn points slightly upward. Behind it, half an inch back, another stem crosses in shadow. Because the thorn stands alone in colder air, it already looks as if it belongs to a different set of conditions, though it is still entirely brown. Nothing is white yet. That fact becomes less empty the longer you stay with it. You begin to notice where whiteness would first show itself if it came. The upper edge of the bud, the side that faces the open sky, offers a clear rim where a thin line could gather. The top of the fork offers two short rising margins. The thorn is so narrow that even a trace would read at once. Lower down, where the stem curves inward and disappears into the hedge, change would be slower, harder to separate from darkness. The sheltered undersides keep their own temperature a little longer. Even before hoarfrost appears, the hedge is already sorting itself. Time passes in this close way. The twig remains brown, then remains brown a while longer, and still the watching changes. At first you may have been checking for evidence, asking whether enough is happening to justify your attention. Gradually the question thins. The bud's surface, which seemed merely sealed, now has a texture to it, not soft and not hard exactly, more like the dry firmness of a scale case. The bark near the fork carries tiny irregularities that would vanish in daylight but matter now because you are near enough to see them. One side stem ends in a blunt old break, another emerges from the darker mesh behind like a penciled line. The cold deepens without spectacle. It is only that the exposed parts of the hedge begin to look cleaner, stricter, as though the air around them has lost one more degree of blur. Moisture in the air does not fall onto the hedge as rain would. It gathers directly onto surfaces cold enough to receive it, settling onto edges and points and the places most open to the sky, passing over others. Then, quietly, there is something to see. Not on the stem first, but on the bud. The upper-facing edge of that small, dormant bud takes on a line so thin you almost mistrust it. Not brightness exactly, more a pale firmness where before there was only brown, a white so fine it seems laid along the top margin with the lightest possible hand. The rest of the bud stays dark, its lower half is unchanged, but along that upper curve hoarfrost has begun to show itself, as if one breath had become visible and then stayed. Once you have seen it, the thorn becomes easier to read. Its tip is whitening too, the side turned outward, and slightly upward, taking the first deposit while the stem behind it remains brown enough to prove the difference. The thorn stands in pale relief on one face only. Behind it the crossing stem is still dark, tucked back in the hedge's shelter. The cold is not general the way a blanket would be general. It settles by exposure, by angle, by texture. You return to the bud because it gives the clearest measure. The white rim has not leapt forward. It has merely thickened by a degree so small that another kind of attention would miss it. Yet now the frost is unmistakable. It catches on the minute roughness along the bud's top edge and around the faint puckering at its base, where the bark gathers in that tiny collar. There is the beginning of another pale trace. The lower seam of the twig remains a dark line. The underside still resists. The fork above the bud starts to read differently as well. One upper edge shows a dim silvering, while the opposite side stays brown. The effect is not decorative. It is structural. The pale deposit makes the shape easier to understand. You can see exactly where the wood turns, where one arm of the fork rises and the other angles out, because the hoarfrost has selected the exposed margins and left the inward seams alone. The hedge becomes more interesting by becoming less uniform. An outer spray of twigs, the ones nearest the lane and open air, gathers narrow white rims first. On older bark the frost looks more granular, finding ridges and minute roughness, so that the white line appears thicker, finely toothed. On the youngest wood it lies in a cleaner trace, almost like chalk along the upper side. One branch can be pale on top and nearly untouched below. One thorn can read white against a still brown field of stems behind it. You widen your attention only a little, just enough to compare. There is another bud farther in, similar in size but less exposed, its edge still mostly dark. A crossing stem tucked into the woven interior shows no pale mark except at one point where it nears an opening. A rough older section near the base of your chosen twig has gathered frost into the bark's shallow furrows so that each ridge begins to stand out. The hedgerow is becoming legible as a small map of air. Still, you keep returning to the original twig. What was plain is now partly outlined. The bud carries its white rim more confidently. The fork is traced on one side, enough that the dark wood inside the angle looks deeper by contrast. The thorn remains the clearest sign of exposure, white along its outer edge, its shadowed side thin and brown. Beneath these pale margins, the wood itself has not vanished. Hoarfrost clarifies form before it obscures it. Deep night gathers, not as an event but as steadiness. The sky has no visible features from where you stand, only a dark openness that seems to draw heat upward from the exposed surfaces of the hedge. The inward-facing seams and undersides, turned toward the hedge's own close shelter, lag behind. The branchwork now begins to emerge as architecture. Short side stems that were once lost in the general dark are picked out along one rim. Thorn bases carry pale collars. Bud stems show narrow white on top and brown beneath. At each fork, two lines meet around a darker seam, and the hedge reads not as a mass, but as a network of decisions made by growth, season after season, now briefly translated into silver and brown. The frost does not cover the geometry, it reveals it. If your thoughts drift away, the hedge gives you something exact to return to. The original bud has broadened its white edge. The tiny collar at its base is clearer now. The old break on a side stem has taken a pale crust on its upper lip and remains dark within. The exposed thorn is almost fully traced, but only on its outer face. Behind it, the recessed stem has finally taken a faint line of its own. There is pleasure in these minor revisions because none of them announces itself. You look, then look again, and find that the fork has sharpened, the bud has acquired more edge, the rough bark near the base has become more articulate. The dark channels remain important. Without them there would be no sense of shape, no inward turn, no sheltered places. Even at this colder hour the interior is not fully claimed. The underside of the twig still carries a brown seam. A crossing stem deep in the hedge remains almost untouched except where it approaches an opening. You can see, with unusual calm, that the night is working by surfaces. Hoarfrost has spread from signs into pattern. The outer lattice of twigs nearest the lane is lightly silvered, not bright, not theatrical. More like a careful edging that has accumulated until it reads across multiple stems at once. The weave inside remains darker and slower, like looking through several layers of handwriting, some strokes newly chalked, others still ink dark. By the stillest part of the night, the anchor twig has become familiar enough that each small change arrives easily. The upper branch of the fork is nearly white along its top ridge. The lower branch holds a finer line, thinner where it turns inward. The bud's rim is now continuous from one shoulder to the other, a delicate border that makes the bud seem more exact in shape, not larger, only more fully seen. Around the bud base, the bark's slight puckering stands in pale relief. The underside seam remains dark and narrow, a reminder that exposure is partial and precise. Nothing in the hedge hurries to completion. There is no moment at which the scene suddenly becomes something else. Instead, the white accumulates grain by grain, edge by edge, with pauses too fine for the eye to count. The mind that first wanted a quick result has less work to do now. Eventually, a change in light begins before the eye fully trusts it. The darkness loosens by a shade. The open air beyond the hedge is no longer black, but a very deep, cold blue, enough to separate the outermost twigs more clearly from what lies beyond. Pre-dawn does not add warmth. It simply grants a wider reading of what the night has already made. The hedgerow, still motionless, shows more of its silvered extent. What seemed isolated now joins into a continuous white margin running along its exposed face. This is the fullest hour. Not because everything is white, but because enough is white, and enough remains brown for the structure to stand clear. Rough bark is translated into pale ridges and dark furrows. Smooth young stems carry cleaner, narrower traces. Thorn tips are white and exact. Bud collars, forks, side stems, and tiny junctions have all taken enough frost to become newly legible. The inner crossings remain quieter, their undersides and sheltered faces holding to brown so that depth stays visible within the silvering. You look at the hedge as a whole for a moment, as much as this close view allows, and it reads as one long boundary delicately marked by the night. Then your attention narrows again to the first twig. It has not been transformed into something ornate. It is the same modest winter twig, with the same small fork and the same dormant bud, only now its form is outlined by what the air has slowly placed there. The bud's upper edge carries a fine white rim. The fork is traced along its exposed sides. The thorn farther out is pale against the deeper weave behind it. Along the lower seam, the wood still shows brown, and in that surviving brown the whole process remains honest. You can tell where the frost has settled and where it has not. You can tell how the night moved across this surface and left others waiting. The first light stays weak and blue. No thaw has begun. Nothing drips. Nothing releases. The hedge stands in a held condition, every edge quiet, every small decision of branching a little clearer than before. The lane and field are present again only as pale openness beyond the close work of stems. The cold remains exact. The air smells faintly of bark and frozen ground. And here, where the watching began, you remain with the one twig that once seemed too plain to keep you company. Its bud is rimmed on the upper side with hoarfrost, delicate and persistent. The fork above it is lightly silvered. The darker wood beneath is still visible, steady under the white. The quicker comfort never came. What came instead was this: bark, angles, still air, and a form made fully legible by cold. You stayed long enough to receive it, one winter twig in a hedgerow, carrying the whole slow night along its edges. Thank you for spending this time with the Night Sky Reader. May your night be peaceful. Until next time, rest well.